What's going on, everybody? Noah from Stage 3 Motorsports here, and today we're going to be jumping in on our 2020 F-150 giveaway truck. Now, we're really going to focus in and have this as kind of just a shop day. It's not going to be a full install with every nut and bolt along the way, but I want to just get the wheels, tires, and suspension figured out, get this truck's stance all set up so it's ready to go, and I think that's going to be the biggest change here as far as the way the truck looks. So if you watch the intro video, you kind of know what direction we're going with the parts, but to give you guys the brief rundown, we have a set of Bilstein suspension front and rear. It's going to be 6112s up front, and I think 5160s in the rear, which are like a piggyback reservoir style shock. And then for wheels and tires, we have some Nitto Terra grapplers and 17-inch fuel Nitro 6 wheels in bronze. So that's going to look great on here. And then we're also going to throw in a Hellwig rear sway bar, kind of stiffen up that rear end, help get rid of some of the body roll and make this thing a little bit more towing capable as well. So with all that out of the way, I'll talk a bit more in depth on the parts as we go through, and you'll see what it takes to throw them on here. But let's get this truck up in the air, get the wheels and tires off, and get down to it. All right, I've got our equipment laid out here, and you can see all the way on the left, we've got the new Bilstein 6112. It's already assembled, and it's got quite a bit larger shock body in diameter, which means that there's going to be more fluid in there and larger piston, which just basically helps with the damping and allows this thing to reduce fade, especially when you're on long trips. You've got a lot of action going up and down. Then the other big reason that a kit like this is helpful is because it's going to change your ride height, and you can kind of adjust how it's changed. So if you see these little grooves here towards the bottom of the body, those have a clip that sits in them. You determine where you want that clip, and that's going to hold the spring seat, which essentially just changes how much pressure is on the new spring that you're getting to determine how much height you need on the truck. And if you look at Bilstein's instructions, they do actually give some handy diagrams here for what clip equals what amount of ride height on the vehicle. So I set ours to 2 inches for this truck. I think that's going to work out perfect for what we need here, but you know, you can go anywhere from stock height all the way up to 1.5 inches, or obviously 2 like we did. But that information's in here as well as torque specs, which is great. But the other thing that you're not seeing here that I wanted to kind of explain, and the reason that there's 2 stock struts here, is that the Bilsteins don't come assembled ready to go. They're not a full coilover. So when you pull your factory strut out, you're going to need to have that spring compressed and have the top hat removed and transferred to the new Bilstein equipment. Now, the spring seat, and obviously the shock and all that is still new, and the little bump inside is all going to be new Bilstein equipment, which is great. You're just reusing that top hat. So if you look at this one, you can see the spring is disconnected from the strut, and this is what you're left with at the end. Generally, you can pay a shop about $50 to $100 depending where you go, and they'll be able to swap those over for you if you don't have the equipment. Real quick, before I bring the new Bilstein suspension up into place, I wanted to point out that I'm going to do another quick install here, and it's these SPC alignment bolts. And this is something that I put on a lot of the other trucks, but I don't always talk about, or we haven't shown a lot, but you might have seen it in our first gen Raptor build when we did that. Basically, these are just alignment bolts for the lower control arm that have a cam on them that rotates within a bracket, and it allows you to adjust the camber in caster and get a better alignment on a lifted truck, and it helps hold the alignment a little bit better than the factory hardware does too. So I'm going to throw this in here, and once you see it installed, it might make a little bit more sense, but that's going to be the next thing to knock out. It does require a little bit of drilling, but nothing crazy. Now that I've got the Bilstein strut in place and we've got the lower arm up here, you can see the cam bolts a little bit better. And like I said, these are just here to help with the alignment, but essentially with the plates in place and this cam on here, if I put a wrench or a socket on the back and turn that bolt, you can kind of see how it rotates around and starts to force the arm either in or out and then shifts it up and down. And because you have these bolts on both the front and the rear mounts, you can kind of adjust the caster with that as well, which makes it really handy. So this is something I recommend doing if you're going to lift your truck and you plan to wheel it pretty aggressively and you want to make sure that you keep a good alignment. Everything is bolted into place up front. It looks like we are pretty much set, but I will say, obviously, grab a torque wrench, go back through. If you're doing this at home, anything that you made loose or pulled out, you're gonna wanna tighten. And in most cases with these kits, it's all gonna be just Ford factory spec, but usually Bilstein includes some torque specs in the manual, so you can check that as well. I'll hit these real quick, and then we're gonna move to the back of the truck and get those rear shocks in. I've got our new 5160 rears here, and you can see that the actual shock size and the diameter of the body of these is actually pretty similar to the factory shocks, but they're clearly a lot nicer quality. And the other big change is that we've got piggyback reservoirs on this. Now, they don't come mounted, so you can see this is kind of loose. I'm gonna leave it like that for now. What we wanna do is just take out the top and bottom bolt holding the factory shock. I'll get that out of there, pop this one into place, and then once we have that locked in, I can add the hardware that Bilstein provides to mount this thing to the back. And the only thing you really want to be careful of here is the actual orientation of the shock. And they do show that in the instructions, but basically on the driver's side where we are now, it's going to sit like this with the resi pointed out towards the back of the truck. So that way there's no risk of it hitting or coming in contact with the axle or anything like that. But with all that out of the way, let's start turning some wrenches and we'll get the factory equipment out of here. So now we've got the rear shocks all wrapped up. The suspension's looking pretty solid. The last thing we have here is this Hellwig sway bar that I mentioned earlier. And I popped this open before just to make sure we got what we needed, but you can see we've got the rear sway bar and then we've got a hardware box in here with all the brackets that we need, as well as the bolts and grease and everything else. And then the instructions, of course. So we'll pull all this out of here, start hanging things up. The brackets you usually start with are the end links, so we'll kind of show you where this goes, but if you do want a full install on one of these, we actually have a video walking through every nut and bolt. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get this thing put together. Well, we've got the sway bar up and in place, so we are at the end now. We've pretty much knocked out everything we need to do for suspension on this truck, but I will say a quick note about these sway bars. I obviously installed this with the truck on the lift above me and the axle is hanging down. Typically, Hellwig recommends that you install these on the ground with the truck's weight seated on it so you can get it adjusted, but in lieu of that, I've left a lot of this stuff loose, so the nuts for the end link adjustments and even the hardware here for the axle mounts is loose, so that way when I do bring the truck back down a little bit, I can kind of readjust that and tighten things up once this bar is level. It's just easier to shoot this stuff in the air to start. So now that that's pretty much done, all that really leaves us is wheels and tires. So I'm gonna get out from under here, bolt that stuff up, and we will be looking pretty. As you guys can see, we got the wheels and tires on, rolled the truck off the lift, and it's finally sitting on the ground under its own weight, and I think it looks much better already. Now, I didn't go into a lot of the specs on the suspension, the wheels and tires as I was doing the install, so if you are wanting some more information, we'll dive into that right now. Obviously, as you saw at the beginning of the video, we started with those 6112 front struts from Bilstein, and then we did the 5160 rear shocks, and I was aiming for about 2 inches of lift in the front, just something to kind of level out the stance, and when I run the measurements now, it looks like we're sitting right at 2 inches, so this is pretty accurate on Bilstein's part. It looks great, and then we didn't add any lift in the back. It's just at stock ride height, and obviously with the shocks, the added benefit there isn't in the lift, it's more so in the ride quality and the performance that you get out of it, because they will certainly outperform the factory equipment that came on this truck. Outside of performance, the suspension kit obviously is going to ride great, and we like the look of the stance, but the other big thing here was getting a little bit more space for a larger wheel and tire. So the tires that we have are Nitto Terra grapplers, and they're 305/70/17s, which is about a 34. And I think that's plenty of tire, especially because it's on a 17-inch wheel, so we've got a little more sidewall to play with. There's some room to air down here. And these are an all-terrain, definitely not the most aggressive tire we've ever ran, but the Terra Grappler is pretty tried and true. And the thing we like is that these perform perfectly well in dirt, washboard roads, a little bit of rocky and muddy terrain, but they also are not a bear to deal with on the street. So for somebody who's gonna daily drive this truck, it's not gonna wear you down with tons of road noise, and they're not gonna throw themselves out of balance or wear weird. It's a pretty reasonable daily drivable tire, and I think it looks great as well. Moving to the wheels themselves, what we have here is Fuel's Nitro 6 wheel in bronze, and this is a 17/9, and we kind of mixed up the size a little bit. I know I do 17s on pretty much every build here. I just think it's the best fitting wheel for an F-150, but in this case, we actually went for a 17/9 with a -12 offset on it, and we wanted something that had a little bit more poke outside of the wheel well. The reason being that in the next video, you'll see that we're gonna do some aftermarket fender flares on here, and I wanted something that lined up flush with those flares to give the truck a wider stance that didn't look ridiculous, but definitely gave it some more presence. So getting the tire outside the wheel well helps quite a bit, and then the wheel design is pretty neat as well. It doesn't have any sort of bead lock or, fancy trim rings or anything like that on it. So it's a little more simple in that regard, but there are a lot of different cuts around the outside edge and some stuff that gives it a bit of depth and detail, which I can appreciate. Now, the last thing to cover is that Hellwig rear sway bar that we threw on. And as you saw with the front suspension, when we did that install, the truck already has a front sway bar, so we weren't too concerned about that. But most F-150s don't come with a rear sway bar, which is where Hellwig comes in. And the basic idea there is that it just provides a little bit of stiffness to help reduce body roll and make towing a bit more controlled, because now that bar is helping to fight the truck's twisting motion as the weight shifts. And Hellwig actually has some good videos kind of explaining the details of how that works, but as you can see, it's pretty simple to mount up. It's just got some brackets that go into the frame, throw the thing on there, hook it up with the end links, and then you just adjust those for the right height of your vehicle to make sure that that bar is sitting level. And in this case, I did it all on the lift like I told you guys because we wanted to make it easier to shoot, but oftentimes if you do it on the ground, it's not too hard and you can kind of see where the bar is at and get your adjustments right off the bat. So this is one of those mods that I would call just kind of a quality of life improvement that I think is going to make the truck handle a little bit nicer on the street and will certainly help whoever wins this if they're going to tow and haul with the thing. That's all I've got for you guys for this video. As always, I appreciate you watching if you stuck it out to the end. Hopefully you guys are enjoying the build so far, and I will see you in the next build video where we're going to tackle those fender flares and an intake and maybe some other accessories as well. So I'll see you guys next time.